Thank you for visiting my virtual poster. My name is Alexa Riobueno-Naylor, and I am a doctoral student in counseling psychology at Boston College. On behalf of my research team, I will be presenting on our poster entitled Cumulative Weather-Related Disaster Exposure in Youth Depression. I look forward to answering any questions and receiving feedback from other Hazards Conference attendees. In the summer of 2021, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded that climate change will have a definitive negative impact on the globe over the next 30 years. Rising temperatures will lead to increases in weather-related events, including heat waves, hurricanes, and tsunamis. Climate change poses a significant threat to the well-being of all individuals, but is particularly threatening to the lives of vulnerable populations, including youth. Children born today will experience extreme climate events at a rate that is 2 to 7 times higher than people born in 1960. Heat waves will be the most prevalent extreme climate event experienced, with 36 times as many occurring for today's youth compared to someone born in the 1960s. Although research has demonstrated how exposure to a single weather-related disaster event impacts youth mental health, more research is needed to evaluate how to support youth exposed to multiple disaster events. To address this limitation, the current study evaluated how exposure to multiple and diverse weather-related disaster events impacted risk for depression in youth living in the United States. Depression is a well-studied mental health outcome associated with disaster exposure in youth. Prevalence rates of depression among youth following weather-related disasters range from 4 to 69%, with rates varying based on time since disaster exposure. Youth are at particularly high risk for developing depression in the face of disasters due to their developmental stage and potential lack of coping mechanisms for dealing with adversity. Youth who have experienced more severe disaster exposure, female youth living in high poverty communities, and youth who experience high levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms are at heightened risk for developing depression post-disaster. The disaster conceptual model of risk and resilience offers a framework for understanding how and why disaster exposure leads to heterogeneous mental health outcomes for youth. The model suggests that exposure to stressors associated with the disaster interacts with pre-existing risk and resilience factors in the young person's environment to impact the degree to which youth can cope within the disaster event. In addition, in the post-disaster context, youth can experience decreases in factors such as social support across critical systems, such as family, school, and community, which only increases their susceptibility to mental health distress. Few research studies have utilized the disaster conceptual model to consider the potential impact of exposure to multiple weather-related disaster events across time in youth populations. The current study draws upon foundational models embedded within the disaster conceptual model to further inform study hypotheses. The first of these foundational models is the dose-response model of psychopathology, which states that the likelihood of mental health distress increases with the severity of exposure to a traumatic event or stressor. It has long been used in disaster research and is a critical component of the disaster conceptual model. However, few disaster research studies have evaluated whether the dose-response relationship between disaster exposure and mental health is maintained with repeated disaster exposure across childhood and adolescence. Research in adult populations suggests a dose-response relationship between disaster exposure and negative mental health outcomes, including depression. However, there is a need for disaster research to evaluate the potential impact of cumulative exposure to multiple disaster types on mental health in diverse youth samples. The second model is ecological systems theory, which is at the core of the disaster conceptual model and has been used within disaster research to evaluate areas of risk and resilience that contribute to the impact of disasters on youth. The theory outlines how development is influenced by factors across multiple environmental systems. Factors across these systems can either lead to or away from psychopathology. Disaster exposure impacts youth across ecological systems, including the microsystem, such as when youth experience home displacement or loss of a parent, the mesosystem, which is negatively impacted when youth experience loss of contact with their social networks during and after the disaster, and the macrosystem, which can be experienced through a lack of post-disaster aid and resources. Disaster-related factors across all of these systems interact with pre-disaster risk and resilience factors. Therefore, in assessing how multiple and diverse weather-related disasters affect youth mental health, Research should address how risk and resilience factors across ecological systems impact the potential dose-response relationship between disaster exposure and mental health. Communities are increasingly experiencing multiple types of weather-related disasters in close geographic and temporal proximity, which means that we need to better understand how these cumulative events impact youth mental health if we hope to design informed interventions for them. Therefore, the current study aims to assess how the dose of exposure to multiple weather-related disaster events over the past 2 years impacts the likelihood of depression in youth, while taking into account factors in the youth's environment across multiple ecological systems. The study aimed to assess whether exposure to a higher number of weather-related disasters, individual risk factors including female assigned sex, older age, and minoritized race and ethnicity, and community-level risk factors including high rates of community poverty, were associated with increased risk for depressive symptoms. Hypothesis 1 stated that youth who experienced a higher dose or number of weather-related disaster events in their lifetime will have increased odds of depression. Hypothesis 2 stated that individual and community risk factors, including female sex, older age, minoritized race and ethnicity, and higher levels of community poverty would also be associated with an increased likelihood of depression. Study data were drawn from 3 publicly available de-identified sources. The first dataset, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, aka the YRBS, is freely accessible for download through the Centers for Disease Control website. The YRBS is a school-based self-report survey which is administered to youth in grades 9 through 12 across the U.S. It includes data regarding student demographics, health behaviors, mental health, and significant life experiences. The current study used data from the 2019 YRBS. Depression was assessed using the following YRBS question. During the past 12 months, did you ever feel so sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks or more in a row that you stopped doing some usual activities? Responses were dichotomized to indicate whether the student answered yes or no to this question. The second dataset that we used was the Open FEMA dataset Disaster Declaration Summaries version 2. It was acquired through the FEMA website. The FEMA dataset includes data related to all federally declared disasters between 1953 and 2021, including the disaster type, location, and timing. The current study focused on disasters which occurred between 2017 and 2019, before the youth completed the YRBS in 2019. The third dataset regarding rates of poverty on the county level were drawn from the U.S. Census Bureau's Quick Facts Data Repository. This data repository includes national and county level data from 2015 to 2019. All data sources were merged into one dataset in SPSS version 27. The dataset included one student from the YRBS dataset per row. Student-level data from the YRBS dataset included the student's location, their sex assigned at birth, their age, their race and ethnicity, and the student's answers to the depression survey question as well. An additional variable was created to assign the county in which the student's school district was located. The number of weather-related disasters experienced by the student between 2017 and 2019, according to their geographic location, was imported from the FEMA dataset. The percent of people living in poverty within the student's county was added into the dataset from the U.S. Census Data Repository. The analytical sample included 45,894 youth between the ages of 12 and 18. 58 disasters, including 36 hurricanes, 14 fires, 5 floods, and 3 severe storms occurred across the sample's 28 districts, which included 15 states, between the years of 2017 and 2019. Figure 1 depicts the dispersion of youth across 15 states included in the sample, as well as the number of youth included in the sample from each geographic region, as shown through the intensity of the red color, with lighter colors indicating smaller samples and darker colors indicating large samples, the number of disasters they experienced, as shown through the size of the gray dots indicating the exact county in which the youth resided, and the percentage of the county in poverty as indicated by the intensity of the blue color dots, with lighter colors indicating lower poverty rates and darker color dots representing higher poverty rates. Analyses were assessed using logistic regression, and the model assessed the association between risk for depression and frequency of disaster exposure, sex assigned at birth, age, dichotomized race and ethnicity, and poverty rates. The overall model was statistically significant. However, disaster exposure in the past 2 years was not significantly associated with increased odds of depression, but it trended in the hypothesized direction. Minoritized race and ethnicity was also not significantly associated with increased odds of depression as hypothesized, which warrants further investigation. As predicted, female assigned sex, older age, and living in a county with higher poverty rates were significantly associated with increased odds of depression. These data suggest that risk for depression due to disaster exposure and other social factors disproportionately impact certain youth, including female youth, youth living in lower income areas, and potentially youth exposed to multiple disaster events across time. The mechanism through which this risk is incurred warrants further investigation in order to inform more targeted interventions for vulnerable youth. The study includes a number of limitations, including the use of cross-sectional data and the fact that validated measures of depression and disaster exposure severity weren't available. Additionally, although the dataset is large and diverse, data are only included from areas in the mainland United States and neglect to incorporate the experiences of youth from much of Middle America, as well as some key coastal areas in the South where weather-related disaster exposure is very high. Future analyses using these data should employ more advanced statistical techniques to assess the potential intervening effects of risk and resilience factors on the relationship between the dose of weather-related disasters and depression in adolescents. Critical research questions remain unanswered regarding the relationship between cumulative disaster exposure and youth mental health outcomes. Some of these questions include, why are females disproportionately negatively impacted, and how can we better tailor post-disaster interventions with their needs in mind? How might we use other existing datasets to assess the diverse factors that contribute to youth mental health outcomes following exposure to multiple disaster events? And what are the characteristics of youth who experience post-traumatic growth after a certain type or dose of disaster exposure? Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I really look forward to hearing from you about any questions or ideas that you may have related to the poster.